Quando olhei a terra ardendo, qual fogueira de São João, eu perguntei.
Are we ready to begin now with our panel? I think everyone is here who's joining us. I see that all of our panelists are here. Okay, wonderful. Just before I begin, so this is a panel 3 on the pandemic, technology, and the right to education. And so welcome everyone. For those of us just joining us, I am Paul Bocking. I am a moderator. I am from Toronto, Canada, with the Canadian Union of Public Employees, CUPE, at the University of Toronto. Pablo Garduno will be taking notes. He is with the Trinational Coalition Defense of Public Education, the students section. I have a few announcements to make before we get started. First one is if there's anyone who requires a certificate of their attendance, then please just make a note of that in the chat. And as you may be aware from the initial section, if you click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen, you can choose translation from Spanish or English, as some of us will be speaking in English, some of us will be speaking in Spanish. So this panel is scheduled to go for about an hour. So we will go till about just before 6:15. We have 3 panelists who I'm going to introduce in a moment. Each of them will have about 10 minutes for their presentation. And then after each presentation, actually after the 3 presentations, then I think we'll have discussion and questions and comments from the audience. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists. And before I turn to the first one, we have Larry Kuhn from Canada. He is a teacher and union leader with the British Columbia Teachers Federation. He was also formerly the Director of Research and Technology with the BCTF. And one of his specialty areas of research has been on the impact of free trade agreements and technology for education. And also he was a co-founder as well of the Trinational Coalition in Defense of Public Education. With us also on the panel, we have Dalila Andrade Oliveira from Brazil. She's a sociologist and a professor of education. She's currently completing her postdoc at the University of Montreal in Canada. And she is a professor in the program of postgraduate studies in education at the Federal University of Mina, Gerais in Brazil, and a member of the coordinating network of studies on teachers' work, which is the Red ESTRADO. Then the third panelist we have today is Roberto Carlos Herrera Albarran from Ecuador. He is a teacher and subdirector of postgraduate studies at the Technical University of Cotopaxi. He's also the former vice president of the National Federation of University Professors and Polytechnical Professors of Ecuador. And he's a current member of the executive committee of this union, and also at various times president of the Association of Professors at the Technical University of Cotopaxi. So at this point then, I'm going to turn over to our first speaker, Larry. And so first we're going to go to Larry for his presentation, and then to Dalila, and then to Roberto. So if anyone has any comments or questions, please use the chat. We'll go through the 3 panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Larry.
See if I can get it to. Thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction. And Sorry about the phone in the background here. I'm going to talk about platform capitalism in education in a time of COVID-19. There's a very high value placed on technology in the pandemic, of course, because of the fact that many students, millions of students around the world have not been in classrooms and have been expected in some way to use technology for their education. And that's made us more vulnerable to the monopoly corporations that control much of the technology. It's important for us to understand the nature of the corporate control and identify ways that we can counter it. The system that has been created for us outside of our control is described by Shoshana Zuboff as surveillance capitalism. The key elements of surveillance capitalism are that data is the key resource. It's sometimes called the oil of the digital age. And we're the data. Everything we do online is captured as data. And the control of the platforms on which we operate are in the hands of a small number of the largest global corporations. These platforms are the base that, Zoom that we're on right now, as well as Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook. And they are all collecting data on us from everything that we do, and that data is then used to produce the algorithms that are so much of dominate what it is that we see in the social media. The corporations have declared that they have the rights to the data, that the data describing our human experience belongs to them when we agree to their terms of service and use the service, that it's no longer ours, but it belongs to the corporations. They can use that data in any way they see fit, including to influence our future behavior. And they can claim the economic value that's created by the use of our data without compensating us. So it's the basic capitalist structure that gives ownership to the corporation and lets them make the profits off of that. Platform capitalism colonizes education. Platform capitalism, is this basis of all of these things that have dominated. One of them, of course, is Google. It's the most significant one in education because Google Classroom, the classroom management system that's now used by hundreds of millions of students and teachers all around the globe. And it's providing massive amounts of data that Google has access to, but which is not available publicly to any of us to see for ourselves what's there, or for researchers to have access to that data for use for public purposes. And Google search is used by teachers to find resources with the bias of algorithms. And we get our students to use Google, and Google's algorithms determine what it is that turns up when they do their search. Google Meet is an online conferencing system that's challenging Zoom. It's again integrated with Google Classroom and consequently used in many classrooms. And YouTube, which is also owned by Google, is the most used source by students in online learning. And it's owned by Alphabet, Google as well. The second most used in the US is something called clever.com. And it's an aggregation platform that school districts are using to gather the students to access the various apps and the like. In Canada, many school districts use their own websites as ways of getting the resources together. In all of these, there are significant issues of surveillance of students and teachers through the tracking of their use of the various services, what has been called by some surveillance creep, that does away with our rights to privacy. The one that has become the most in the public view recently is Facebook, which is also owns Instagram and WhatsApp. And for those who don't have access to other forms of social media for education, WhatsApp has become a major source on phones for students who don't have access to the internet and computers. This collects data on more than 2 billion people. And we saw when Facebook went down for six hours a couple of weeks ago, how much of the world is dependent on Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp for their communications. Its profits, like all of the platforms, depend on the engagement of the users. Young people are primary targets of this. It's come out, particularly again in the last weeks, that Facebook knows from its own research the negative impact that it has on young people, that the whistleblower who testified before Congress a couple of weeks ago pointed that out and brought forward the research, Facebook's own research on this. But removing the harmful and toxic content would reduce their profits. So they choose to maintain the negative aspects of their platform rather than to reduce the profits that they have. In response to that, we need laws and regulations that limit data collection on youth in particular to make profits. We need these regulations and legal limits for everybody, but especially for young people or the students that we have responsibility for. So the key issues in all of this is that technology is not neutral, that there's a monopoly, that industry's concentration means it controls who speaks and who hears what they say. There are significant issues of equity. Levels of access vary according to social class, to income, and to geography. Already existing inequalities in the globe are increased by what's happening with the platforms. Privacy and surveillance is a dominant problem. Privacy is key to personal autonomy and to development of individual development. And it's threatened in many ways in these technology. Finally, every tool shapes the task. How is the technology influencing or determining pedagogical practices? I think we saw some of that in the earlier presentation that Andre made. So I think that when I started working in this area several years ago, I didn't have much faith that it was going to be possible to get governments to act to start to control these technologies. But I think we've seen that there is sufficient public knowledge and public concern now on a global basis that there is some action being taken. Certainly in Europe, in the United States, the Congress is now looking at taking some action to control Facebook. and some of the practices of the other technologies. So I think that we have to look to that in the future to say that you know, there has to be control of this, or these technology companies will control our lives in fundamental ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry, for your presentation. Muchísimas gracias. In this case, then, I'm going to go to our next presenter, Dalila, Andrade, Oliveira, if you're ready to go ahead. Thank you.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches a todos los compañeros, compañeras que nos acompañan en esta actividad. Yo primero quiero agradecer a los compañeros de la Red CEPA por la invitación para estar aquí. Y yo estoy aquí como Red ESTRADO, Red Latinoamericana de Estudios sobre Trabajo Docente, una red que ha cumplido 21 años en el último diciembre y que es una red muy cercana a la Red CEPA porque tenemos objetivos e intereses muy parecidos y que nos unen en muchas luchas comunes en América Latina. Yo quisiera comentar con ustedes una encuesta que hicimos desde la Red ESTRADO, un trabajo colectivo, involucrando a muchas compañeras y compañeros, algunos incluso que están aquí nos siguiendo en esta actividad, y que justo tiene que ver con el tema de este panel, que
This
es
panel, which is the fact that during the pandemic, as to protect students, face-to-face classes were banned in many parts of the world. In Latin America, it took longer to go back to the physical classroom than in the rest of the world, according to a UNICEF report. So during the pandemic, we as ESTRADO Network, we carried out a research in 13 Latin American countries with the purpose of getting to know how this work, how the work of teachers was happening during the pandemic in public schools or that were receiving public funding, since our concern is around the right to education in a region, since we are the most unequal region in the world, and we're also one of the regions in which a great part of the population is living under the line of poverty. For us, it was very important to realize how this work was being developed and how the population that required public services were faring during the pandemic. 10 minutes are not enough for me to speak about the survey, but just to give you some findings, our region is highly unequal. Poverty has grown, obviously, during the pandemic, even though the world's wealth has grown in North America, Europe, and China. In our region, there's less wealth instead of more. Poverty is the one that has increased. According to an ECLAC report, we see that 20% of the population in Latin America 75% of the people of the high class are connected to the network, but the 20% of the lower income population, out of them, only a 37% has Wi-Fi access or internet connection. So that is why it was so important for us to see how education, public education, was taking place with all of the connectivity issues during the pandemic. This is how the countries in which the survey took place. In Brazil, it was done in June, and in the rest of the countries you see on the map next to it, we did this by the end of November, beginning of December last year. One of the things that we realized is that most of the teachers, around 90% of them, are now paying more in the 13 countries in which we had the survey. They were working during the pandemic, working more, And even though they were working from home, they were working, most of them, paying for their own resources, their own laptops, their own electric bills, their own mobiles. They were in charge of paying for their own internet connectivity and resources. Something else that we realized that was happening has to do with this panel was the difficulty, aside from the difficulty of teachers connecting to the internet as well as students, because we asked teachers about access, the connectivity of their students, and what we saw was that many of the students, many of the teachers answered that there was a reduction of student participation because of connectivity issues. What we saw as well was that lack of resources, starting with a good, solid internet connection in the homes of teachers, and the lack of a good training or previous experience in this type of digital arenas, the platforms, the virtual teaching techniques using the technologies that they had to adapt very quickly for the pandemic. This was a great problem for many of the teachers. As you can see here, the best situation was found in Chile and Brazil, but generally speaking, the situation was not good, especially in Honduras, which is one of the poorest and most unequal countries of our region. Something else that we tried to understand was whether it was easy or difficult for teachers to deal with the technologies. And this is where we realized that it depended on the generation. The youngest teachers, they had more knack or less difficulties in working with technologies than the people who have more experience or are older in the educational field. This is something that was striking because in many countries, most of the teachers are above age 40. That is to say, they belong to generations that were not raised in the digital era. This is important in our perspective with the things that we were trying to achieve with the survey by involving all of the people who belong to ESTRADO network in all of the countries in which we applied the survey. Because these dimensions, I could speak about other things, other data we collected with the survey, but this is information that can perhaps help us explain something else that I will now present and which is very worrisome. And with this, I would like for us to make some reflections, perhaps for a small debate, and that is that due to the connectivity issues, due to the fact of sometimes people not having the devices or a training or a training, if it was not before the pandemic, at least during the pandemic, so that people could be aided, there was a complete lack of that. And there was little experience with digital resources. And this could explain the fact that, as you can see on this last slide that I'm presenting, in most of the countries, rather in all of the countries, most of the teachers reported that their work overload increased quite a lot in terms of how they needed to prepare in comparison to face-to-face classes. In the case of Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, Panama, those are countries in which more than 90% of the teachers that answered the survey, they said that they were working much more during the pandemic just to get ready the class for the next day than what they did before when they taught face-to-face. And what is the problem with this? It's that teachers were working more during the pandemic, but those teachers were also having less participation of the students. The contents were not attractive, we were not reaching them, so there was a social debt that was created here. So that is what I wanted to say. I conclude just by saying that during the post-pandemic era, we need to think about our societies are so unequal. There are so many structural changes that are needed. And we also need to start thinking about connectivity, access to the internet as something that should be universal, a right, a public right that has to be guaranteed by all states, by all countries. Thank you. So I'm here at your disposal for your questions or for the debate.
Muchas gracias, Dalila, por tu presentación. Thank you very much for your presentation, Dalila. I'm now going to go to our third presenter, Roberto. If you are ready, may go ahead. Thank you. And just a reminder that after Roberto, we will then go to questions from attendees.
Sí, muchas gracias, Paul. En primer lugar, quiero
Thank you, Paul. First of all, let me thank Idea Network for their kind invitation. And I would like to thank the panelists as well, because they have touched upon very interesting things. So I just want to reinforce some ideas that they have already presented. Let me speak about what's happened in my country, in Ecuador, because I'm speaking on behalf of the Cotopaxi Technical University, as well as the National Federation of University and Polytechnical Education. I believe that the pandemic is something that caught everyone by surprise. We never imagined, we never foresee this, but what it has caused or forced us to see is that we're forced to see our weaknesses as a society. So I would like to share some statistics about what happened in Ecuador during and after the pandemic, and that we as educators believe we need to be aware of that reality. First of all, we must say that on March 17, 2020, in Ecuador, there was a suspension of face-to-face classes. So 4.6 million students of the higher education or the elementary and the middle school education systems could not go back to their schools. More than 700,000 higher education students were also left without the opportunity to attend physical environment. So one of the problems that we had to face in the reality is to realize that there's a technological gap in our country's region and world. But in this case, in the case of Ecuador, it was something that was quite noticeable. According to some studies done by university teachers, they did some research and realized that in the beginning of the pandemic, 75% of the households did not have a PC computer, not a laptop, not a PC, nothing. 37.2% of the households in the country did not have internet connection. And if we see the type of connection people have, if they had it, it was just based on mobile data systems that were not very good in terms of the quality and the cost. In the rural area, the situation was even more complicated. Only 61.1% of the people had an internet connection. That was in 2020. So there was also an explosion of the social gap, the social inequality, because unemployment grew from 3.9 in December 19 to 13.3 in June 2020. 1.4 million people out of the 17 million Ecuadorians there are became extremely poor, and 1.8 million fell under the poverty lines. So in terms of the educational environment, the governments follow the recipes they do in every crisis. People who should pay the consequences should always be the most or the lowest income social classes. There were budgetary cuts for elementary education, high school education, higher education. Teachers were massively laid off. The investment that was made was quite poor and deficient, because the optimal thing would have been for the state to guarantee people could have access to education by giving them internet connection, but they didn't. There was no effort, no public policy to grant more people access. The infrastructure in education was already limited before the pandemic. So during the pandemic and after the pandemic, we've been having problems in terms of our infrastructure. And something that was also mentioned by my other peers was that the training of teachers was not appropriate, because remote education was seen as something that was far away from us. It was a sudden change, quick change, very demanding one. And therefore, that's how we had to face the reality. But it's what is happening now. There is an attempt to have kids go back to school, physical schools, but no studies were made. It's been done in a very, without a thoughtful consideration. We didn't think about the economic impact this would have in the households of Ecuadorians, especially since the economy is so punished. Our limited infrastructure still remains. There is still perhaps more students enrolling, but there's not an infrastructure for the students to be received to guarantee that they will be safe. And the technological gap, even though households have tried to solve the connectivity issues, to have access to a computer, this is something that is not completely solved. The social indicators currently, what is happening, poverty is reaching a 32.2%. And if we consider that it is the people who are living with less than $84.4 a day, extreme poverty has reached 14.7 with less than $47.7 a day. The unified wage is $400, while the basic staple is $14. So there's a monthly increase of fossil fuel prices, and the intention for the government is to implement a neoliberal agenda, an agenda that is sticking to the free market, fiscal and labor matters, which affects once again the poor the most. Ecuador has become into a very unsafe place, and we have a state of exception that's been decreed. It is not that curfews have been installed, not to fight crime, but to prevent people from demonstrating. So there's repression happening in our country. We also see that in the field of education, once again, there are budgetary cuts, and some educational reforms are being planned for higher education so as to favor private education and to affect public education. So access to education is trying to be solved without increasing a single peso for the public or polytechnical schools. It is said that universities will recover their autonomy, that they will be able to discuss their own educational offer or proposals, but no programs, nothing is being financed. So for public education, there are no funds, everything is for the private ones. So CUPE and university guilds, from the very beginning of the pandemic, And during a time in which the lockdown was more severe, we never gave up our mobilization activities. We were having a legal fight with institutions like CES or the National Assembly or the public institutions or the court, even when some not constitutional amendments were attempted. We have been fighting to defend public education and to defend the most widely affected sectors of the country. Let me finish by saying something that has been said before. First of all, there's a need for us as organizations to keep on including the combating of the system and inequality, which is the origin of all of the evils that we face. We need to persist in the defense of the right to public free education. We need to include, or rather, instead of including, to give more strength to the agendas to combat the technological gap as a way in which we can guarantee access to education and to keep on participating in all of the fights that we have with the different social sectors. So this is what I wanted to share with you, everyone. Thank you, Paul, and to all of the people who have attended. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for your presentation. And thank you also very much to each of the panelists who were very punctual and within their time frames as well too, and very well organized. So we now have some time for some discussion. So what I would like to ask is if any of the attendees would like to ask a question, if you could use the hand button, the little hand button, to indicate that you'd like to be added to the speakers list. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a few people, and then I will select each person, and then after we go through a few people, then we'll go to the panelists and invite the panelists to respond. So we'll spend a few minutes doing this, and then before we conclude the session, we will also give a little bit of time for each of the panelists to also give some concluding remarks. And also as well too, if you prefer, you can also write your comment in the chat as well, if you prefer, and I can just read out your comment as well, if you prefer to do that rather than to speak. So first we have here as our first person commenting or questioning, we have Sarah Unda. Go ahead, Sarah.
Buenas tardes a todos. Muchas
Good
gracias.
afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. I would like to congratulate the speakers. I have a question regarding the three presentations, because on the one hand, the three that had to do with Latin America, they spoke about the need of universalization of access to technology and access to the internet. But on the other one, Larry has warned us that these technologies are privatized, they have their own agenda, and their purpose is to commoditize education, to privatize education where we'll be controlled. And this is going to cause other ways in which the pedagogy is going to be affected, it's going to be standardized, and little space, little room will be given to critical thinking or diverse thinking. So it seems to be that yes, we need access to technology, but how do we do it in a safe way so as not to fall prey of the big transnationals? That's one crucial question, because at least in terms of the resistance, people who have not had access to technology, even though it is true that the inequality is important and it has caused a situation of inequality that is very severe, it is also true that these people, they are not being surveilled, they are not being controlled. There is like certain situation that has to be managed carefully, because those, your proposals were perhaps, if you may, contradictory, and therefore we need to find a different way in which we approach technologies. It is not only asking that we all have internet connection, but how or what type of connection are we asking to have?
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm next going going to go to our next person here. We have Rodolfo.
Sí, más que una pregunta, un comentario.
It is not a question, but rather a comment. It's a contradiction that has to be figured out somehow. And the second one is that, according to the conclusions of Professor Roberto, I believe that part of what we would have to rethink as something that is important to defend public education is access to health, and all of those elements that are also accompanied by the cuts, not only in terms of education, but also health, and this commoditization view of how the pandemic has been handled and how it's been a business for just a few people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. Next, I'm going to go to Mariluz.
Gracias.
Thank you, Paul. I also agree with Sarah's point. I remember that during a seminar that we had in Idea Network, there was something that was said by somebody from Ecuador that said that technology did not ask permission, the pedagogist's permission to enter the schools. Never did they ask permission. So the interest of the big transnational companies has been said, has been profit-oriented, we all know that, and therefore they are acting for that purpose. So I do see this contradiction that Sarah has mentioned, and I also believe that at the same time, the question should be, does that mean that we are rejecting the new technologies? Because now it is impossible to do that. If in the past, at some point, we thought we could resist them, now it is impossible. The pandemic massified its use. So thinking about how to come up with proposals and how to write all this down, Dalila says something that we share in Idea Network. We have said that access to internet has to be universal, free, and it has to be a right, a public good. And this is something, we need to have a campaign for this, but at the same time, we need to ask ourselves what Larry has told us, which is the regulation of the big transnationals of the ITC, the TICs, because, well, the states are not doing this. The state has to play a role in this. How? I don't know. How do we control the IT companies? But it's important for us to do that. And the third thing that is connected to this is that technology is not neutral. Andre has already said how this has been presented from OECD. Larry has explained it as well. But what do we need to do as teachers, men and women, so as to try and change this? How do we bring technology at the service of pedagogy? This is something that has to be explored. And finally, to wrap it up, I believe that we require, as I said, we need to place a problem center stage. And that is how labor has become more precarious for teachers, but at the same time, how health has been affected, which the impact has been enormous. The massive use of IT technologies has been enormous. So it was not a question, it was a comment. Let us hope that this can be included in the rapporteur's notes.
Next, I'm going to go to Edgar for your comment or question.
Buenas tardes con todos y con todas.
Hello, everyone. We all agree that it is not just about saying yes or no to the technology or the technology within the classroom, yes or no. Technology has always been around or inside the classroom, but now it is an electronic one, a digital one. But during the 1970s, we were having a discussion about educational technologies, and we were discussing about how to use instruments that right now they're obsolete, but back then they were state of the art. everything is a technology, depends on how you use it. Even the blackboard was an introduction of technology. So how do we work around this? Because yes, technology is not impartial, it's not biased. So how can we make it serve the peoples? If it is not a discussion about whether or not to say yes or to technologies, we should ask who is the technology favoring or benefiting. That's a core question. How do we make certain that this technology is combined, is used at certain moments? How do we control it? But we bring it to the surface of an emancipating education and to the possibility of having human beings all together, being able to understand the messages and to understand fake news and truly be able to interpret information. So here come other questions. When technology, what moments, what type of technology? So at center stage is always the praxis, the debate, the execution of the tasks, as well as education to transform the world, not education just for the sake of the creation of labor force. So I believe that those are considerations that have to be included, because I do think that sometimes we get too much engaged on whether we should reject technology, and we're past that debate. And by this, I mean teachers all throughout the continent. Thank you.
Does any one or two more speakers like to comment or have a question before we return to the panelists? Any more questions or comments? I see there's some comments here in the chat too, and greetings and other comments on the speakers too. So good comments there too. Cecilia, yes, go ahead.
Sí, disculpa, se está fallando mi internet.
Sorry, I have a very choppy connection. I believe that, yes, we live in the 21st century, but the challenge as educational workers now is how do we keep the philosophical essence of the love to life, respect to nature, otherness, which is a word that was coined by Paulo Freire. We are facing a situation in which we cannot go back. There's no going back. We all had to get used to working remotely, to speak in front of a microphone and not knowing if people are listening to us. So how do we recover this important essence of education for life? Something that was proposed by Claudio Freire. That was a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. And I saw you asked a question in the chat, so I'm sorry for not identifying that earlier. Thank you for raising that. Okay, in that case, then I am now going to.
Está bien, gracias.
Gracias. In that case, then I'm now going to return to our panelists to provide their responses and their concluding remarks. So I'd ask each panelist to take about 5 to 7 minutes for their responses. So first, I will go to Larry, and then Dalila, and then Roberto.
Thank you. That's a very interesting discussion, and the results of the surveys, that were reported on, are somewhat different from what they would be in Canada, because we have much more access to the technology, more universal access to technology. But the issues still were very similar, particularly the suddenness with which the classrooms shut down and teachers were told to move online, and that was done with no training, really no preparation, no thinking through of what pedagogical practices were appropriate for an online kind of learning. So I think that the training of teachers is a really important aspect, that the other panelists picked up on. But the training, I think, has to be of three types. One is just that in the use of the technology, and that was pointed out that the teachers over 40 probably were much less comfortable in using the technology than the younger teachers, and and clearly there has to be training so that people get used to the techniques of using the technology itself. But more importantly is training in two other critical aspects. One is developing a critical perspective, a philosophical perspective towards the technology, to understand whose interests are being served by the structure of the capitalist structure in which the technology has been is being developed. And if teachers are going to be able to use it in a critical way with their students, they need to have that deeper understanding of the social and economic aspects of it, not just the techniques of the technology. And the third one is that we have to develop critical pedagogy for online practice, and the kinds of what we're being offered by the corporations are basically packages of resources that are developed, and they don't have a critical pedagogical perspective to them. In fact, just the opposite. They tend to be more focused on job training types of things, and certainly not on a deep, critical understanding of the society. And so I think we have to develop shared exchanges of, teachers working together on what critical pedagogy online looks like, and sharing what we've developed in that, so we aren't dependent on what the corporations are developing, but rather are developing a social, social critical kind of set of practices in the online teaching that inevitably will be going on to some degree, even when we are able to return to the classroom. That there's no doubt that the disruption of that we've faced, has meant that there is going to be a lot more use of the technology in the future as well. So that's it. The main thing I'd like to leave with is that we have to have both the critical perspective and critical pedagogy within the context of training of teachers for use of the technology.
Thank you very much, Larry, for your intervention. Next, I'm going to go to Dalila.
Bueno, a mí me parece que estamos viviendo una situación que es completamente novedosa. Un momento, porque estoy escuchando en inglés la traducción. No sé por qué me vuelve el audio.
A todos.
Sí. Ahora sí. Bueno, yo quería...
So as I was saying, I wanted to say that what has happened in our societies was that almost overnight, everything that we did face-to-face had to be done in the remote environment. So there was no planning. There was no clear emergency situation like with this thing with the pandemic. And therefore, our public systems in Latin America, our universities, in one way or another, they had to resort to the digital giants so as to keep on offering any type of education. And that is why we're here in Zoom. But in my public education where I work, I mean, we didn't have the time. There was no way for us to protect our rights as users and as workers. When we think about what Sara Onda has led us to think, it is very important because there are some matters that could be contradictory. At the same time, we're looking for universal right to connectivity, but we also need to, in our countries, with our governments, we need to keep on working in the construction of public platforms, because we also need, as we said in the beginning of this activity, as Marilu said, technology is not neutral. Technology in this capitalistic society, as Larry has said in his presentation, there are many interests that are behind the digital giants, because these are new agendas from the perspective of the right of citizens, but it also has to do with the rights of educational workers, because the work of teachers has changed a lot during the pandemic. The pandemic has accelerated the use of artificial intelligence in the work of teachers, things that we never thought of for us who have thought about teachers' work. So all of this happened without us getting ready, without us negotiating with the government. So what we've seen now is that teachers are now facing new risks to health. For instance, the visual health, spending all day long in a chair is affecting our spines, and all of those things. Well, they are affecting us. But what Marilusa said, how the teachers' labor has, the precarization has also increased. What we have seen is that, for instance, in certain countries, such as in the case of Brazil, teachers who didn't have work stability, that were not public officials, they lost their jobs. Their contracts were not renewed. And so teachers who are public officials, they started to work more and have more students, because now they don't need everyone to be inside the same classroom. They can be wherever. They can teach a class to 100 students in a platform. So those are matters that are disguised as a part of flexibilization or becoming more modern, but in essence, they are making the work of teachers, the labor conditions of teachers, worsen. And this is something that has to be stopped. Yes, it is. We don't want to go out of the pandemic with worse working conditions as workers that before the pandemic. And on the other hand, we also need to think about how in our Latin American reality, and well, with many of the international organizations, there's this discourse that the teaching of the future is going to be a hybrid one, and that the hybrid methods could cause losses on both sides, causes on the side of teachers, because this could mean that people could lose their job, lose their stability, or their labor conditions, or other benefits. And also there could be an impact on the students that are having the worst conditions. So in the survey, there are lots of other interesting figures you could see. I'll send you the link where you can find 2 ebooks that we have just published about the survey. One of them has a full chapter for each country, how the survey took place in each country. The other book has a comparison of the 13 countries. So I am going to give you free access to it, so you can go and check it and use this information. Let me conclude by saying that This is a time with a lot of threats around us. The things that we could face after the pandemic, it's all very dangerous, starting by the fact that there's been a growth of the control of the digital platforms in the ways in which we operate, as well as how we have gone through changes, cultural changes. The world has changed. The way in which we operate has changed in the last year and a half. And so it is important for us to think about those changes from the perspective of teachers, the right to be disconnected. It has to be brought to the agenda. Teachers cannot be available 24/7 because now that's the expectation. Because now teachers and students are used to talk anytime, but it has some limits have to be set. Never again will we go back to the past. Those changes have taken place. There's no going back. WhatsApp group will remain, as well as other platforms, but nothing is going to replace, nothing is going to substitute the work face-to-face of teachers and working with others, because the human interactions, the human relationships, the live interaction, that cannot be substituted. So it is very important for us to keep that in mind, that yes, we will go back to face-to-face. During the pandemic, schools have proven that they are more than just places where we exchange knowledge. It's a place in which we live together, we create solidarity. So it is very important for us to reinforce that. So thank you, everybody. And let us hope that we will continue with this dialogue at some other point. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, gracias, Dalila. Solo tenemos un ponente más. Vamos a escuchar, sorry, I've seen, thank you. We have one more presenter. This is Roberto. I'm going to go with Roberto now for his concluding remarks, and then we will return to the plenary session. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Let me share with everyone that I agree with what has been said so far. The pandemic has taught us that we're very fragile as societies, as people. So this fragility, it is related to the fact that we've always been a very unequal society. This ability of capitalism to make everything a commodity is what caused technology not to be neutral. Technology is, after all, a business and will keep on being a business as long as we live in the system. Now, on the other hand, we should not think that we can do without it. No, what we need to defend is that we have to make certain that the access to knowledge should be universal. Universities, education, we are the ones who create the knowledge. The big technological companies, they are the ones who have the patents. They are the ones who are profiting from, because it's not only that the universities produce the knowledge, it's just that they profit from it. So the problem is that lies within society. So I agree with the question of Rodolfo. I believe that education should never be separated from health. As a matter of fact, those are two very important poles of society. The crisis that we went through was a crisis of health, but it ended up being a social crisis, an educational crisis. So the effects the pandemic has had on human beings, we're barely beginning to study them. The impact from the psychological, physical effect, it's been terrible. labor impact, the fact that we had to change to a virtual environment has brought with it very complicated things to deal with. To give an example, in Ecuador, we are a country in which most of the population doesn't have the right type of employment. Informal employment is what predominates here. People make a living by selling things out on the streets or cooking something. So when there was a lockdown, that big percentage of the population couldn't support their families. So I remember that the authorities used to say that citizens were not very responsible because they didn't respect the lockdown and that they were ignorant because they didn't stay home. But the reality is that if they didn't go out, they couldn't survive. So those situations are very complicated, very complex. And this is something that will have to be studied. And as organizations, we need to fight to make certain that we will have a better reality. I always believe that it is possible to build a better society, to create a better world. So in this exchange that we're having today, at the end of the day, what we want to have is a transformation, and this is not done just by anyone. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Roberto, and thank you very much to all.
Gracias, Roberto. Gracias a los panelistas. Y con esto concluimos con esta sesión. Les pido a todos, por favor, que regresen ya al link original en el que se habían unido para que tengamos nuestra sesión plenaria del cierre. Entonces, por favor, regresemos todos a la liga anterior, al link anterior para la plenaria. Nos vemos allá. Gracias.
¿Puedes repetirlo en español? Creo que no había traducción.
Sí, en estos momentos ya concluimos este taller y ya podemos regresar al otro link de Zoom por la plenaria por concluir las actividades de hoy.
Muchas gracias. Gracias a
Hasta
todos.
luego. Bye bye. Hasta luego.